The key was the smallest thing she owned. Smaller than her wedding ring, smaller than the locket her mother had pressed into her palm on the morning of her wedding day, smaller than the folded note she had kept in her coat pocket for 31 years without ever once leaving it behind. It was a brass key, no longer than her thumb, worn smooth on one side from the pressure of Raymond's hand around it every time he climbed the stairs. She had watched him hold it so many times without ever thinking to ask what it opened. She had watched him turn it in the lock at the top of the stairs, watched the door swing inward, watched the darkness receive him, and she had turned away each time and gone back to whatever she had been doing. That was the thing about a marriage that works. You learn which questions not to ask. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Eleanor Marsh had been a good wife. She wanted to be clear about that, not as a defense, not because she needed the credit, but because it was the foundational fact of the last 31 years of her life, and it deserved to be said plainly. She had been a good wife to Raymond Marsh in the way that some women of her generation were good wives completely, without reservation, without the kind of carefully maintained separateness that younger couples seem to consider healthy. She had folded herself into his life because that was what love had felt like to her when she was 38 and lonely, and Raymond had appeared at her sister Carol's dinner party with his quiet laugh and his careful manners and his way of looking at her like she was the answer to something he had been trying to work out for a long time. She had been 38 when they married, which her mother had called late and her sister Carol had called practical and Ellie herself had simply called right. She had not been in a hurry to find a husband. She had worked for 12 years as an accounts administrator at a regional insurance firm in Clover Hill, Virginia, a small city set in the foothills where the Piedmont begins to soften toward the mountains, and she had built herself a life that was modest and self-sufficient and genuinely hers. A one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with good light. A cat named Philip who slept on her feet. A Sunday habit of walking to the bakery on Clement Street for coffee and a newspaper and an hour of reading before the week reclaimed her. She had not been unhappy before Raymond. That was important. She had not been waiting to be rescued. She had simply met him and understood in the way you understand certain things, quietly, with no drama, that her life was about to change shape, and that she wanted it to. Raymond Marsh was 51 when they married, a widower of 7 years, a civil engineer who had spent 2 decades designing infrastructure projects for the county and who had the organized, methodical quality of a man who has spent his professional life accounting for every variable. He was tall and lean with gray beginning at his temples and hands that were always slightly rough from weekend work on whatever project was currently occupying the outbuilding behind the house on Sycamore Road, the house he had lived in for 22 years and which had been, before Ellie, the house he shared with his first wife, Margaret, who had died of a sudden cardiac event at 44 and left Raymond with the particular silence of a man who has lost the person who made the noise of daily life feel like company rather than interference. Ellie had known about Margaret from the beginning. Raymond had told her on their second meeting, not with heaviness, not with the careful management of someone delivering information they expect to be a problem, but with the straightforward honesty of a man who did not see the point of withholding. Margaret had been kind, he said. She had been good. She had died before either of them was ready, and he had spent 7 years learning to live in a house that had been designed for 2 people and now held only 1. He said all of this looking directly at Ellie, and then he asked her about herself with the specific, focused attention of a man who genuinely wanted to know. She had moved into the house on Sycamore Road in the spring of the year they married, brought her furniture and her books and Philip the cat and her Sunday habit of coffee and newspaper reading, and she had made the house hers in the gradual way of someone who does not hurry things that deserve to be unhurried. She had repainted the kitchen a warm cream. She had planted a kitchen garden along the south-facing fence where the light was best. She had replaced the curtains in the front room and kept the ones in the bedroom because Raymond liked them and they were good curtains, and there was no reason to change a thing simply because it predated her. There was only the one door she had never opened. The attic door at the top of the stairs was always locked. Not conspicuously locked, not in a way that drew attention to itself, but locked in the steady, quiet way of something that has been that way for long enough that it simply becomes part of the architecture of a place. There was a small brass lock set into the door, old, original to the house, and Raymond had a key for it on the ring he kept in his left trouser pocket, separate from his other keys, which he kept on a hook by the back door. The attic key stayed with him. It went with him to work. It came home with him in the evening. It sat on the nightstand when he slept, and in the morning it went back into his pocket before he had fully finished dressing. She had asked once, early in the marriage. Not with suspicion, she wanted to be clear about that, not with any particular weight behind the question. She had simply been in the hallway sorting linens and had looked up at the door and said, almost as an afterthought, "What do you keep up there, Raymond?" And he had paused, just a pause, not a hesitation, not a flinch, and he had said, "Old things, Ellie. Things from before." And something in his voice, not secrecy exactly, more a kind of old grief that he was not asking her to enter, had made her nod and turn back to the linens, and she had never asked again. This was what she meant when she said she had been a good wife. Not that she was incurious. Not that she was without feeling on the matter. But that she understood, in the particular way of a woman who had also had a life before Raymond, that there are rooms inside a person that belong to their history and not to their marriage, and that the most generous thing a partner can do is sometimes simply not to knock. She had never knocked. Raymond Marsh died on a Tuesday in late October, 11 months ago, at 77 years old, in the hospital bed that had been set up in the front room because the stairs had become difficult in the final months. He had a cerebral hemorrhage, which the doctors described as sudden and as relatively peaceful, which Ellie took to mean that he had not suffered long. He had been unconscious for 9 hours before the end. She had held his hand for all 9 of them except for 20 minutes when Carol had made her go eat something in the hospital cafeteria, and she had eaten half a sandwich without tasting it and come back and taken his hand again, and that was how it had been when he died, her hand in his, the window showing the parking lot and the gray October sky beyond it. Raymond's children were grown and from his first marriage, and they did not live in Clover Hill. He had 2 sons, Daniel and Paul, who had been civil and carefully polite to Ellie across 31 years in the specific way of adult children who accept a step-parent without ever quite warming to the situation. They had called at holidays. They had come for Christmas most years and had sat at the table she set and eaten the food she made and thanked her with the punctilious courtesy of people fulfilling an obligation. They were not unkind. They were not cruel. They were simply the children of a man who had loved their mother deeply, and Ellie had always understood that there was a loyalty in that, even when it made the holidays feel slightly formal, slightly managed, slightly like a performance everyone was committed to getting through without incident. It was Raymond's siblings who were another matter. There were 3 of them. His older brother Walter, 64 and retired from a career in commercial real estate, lived in Richmond with his wife Patrice, who wore silk blouses and had a habit of looking at Ellie's kitchen the way a building inspector looks at a property they already know is not going to pass. His sister Frances, 61, lived 30 minutes away in a town called Braden that Ellie had always thought suited her, small and a little pinched and convinced of its own importance. And the youngest, Gordon, 58, who worked in insurance and who had the habit of calling Raymond on Sunday evenings for conversations that Ellie was not unwelcome to hear but somehow never seemed to be invited into. Walter, Frances, and Gordon had not approved of Ellie in 1993 when she married Raymond, and they had conducted the 31 years that followed with the patient persistence of people who are simply waiting for a situation to resolve itself in their favor. They had been waiting, she understood now with the particular clarity that grief gives you, for Raymond to die. Not out of malice. She did not think it was malice. It was something older and more instinctive than malice. It was the territorial certainty of family, of blood, of the belief that what Raymond had built across his life, the house on Sycamore Road, the savings, the investment accounts, the 40 acres of land he had accumulated along the river bottom south of town over 20 years of careful acquisition belonged to them in some essential way that her 31 years of marriage did not override. Raymond's will had been clear. She had seen it, signed it as a witness when the attorney drafted it 12 years ago. The house was hers. The savings were hers. The investment accounts transferred to her. The land, the 40 acres along the river, was to be divided equally between Ellie and Raymond's 2 sons, with a provision that Ellie had right of first refusal if either son chose to sell. It was orderly and it was fair, and it was exactly the document of a man who had spent his professional life accounting for every variable. Walter had retained an attorney within 6 weeks of the funeral. The challenge, as Frances explained to Ellie over the phone in early December with the particular tone of someone delivering news they had been anticipating with pleasure, was that Raymond's mental capacity in the final months of his illness was in question. There was a concern, Frances said carefully, that the later amendments to the will, amendments made 4 years ago that had restructured the land distribution, had been made at a time when Raymond was not fully himself. It was not an accusation, Frances said. It was simply a question that needed to be asked. Ellie had sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after Frances said this, looking at the front room where Raymond had died, at the window with the view of the yard she had gardened for 31 years, at the corner where the hospital bed had been and where the reading chair now sat again in its proper place. Then she said, very calmly, that she would have her attorney call theirs, and she had put the phone down. She was 69 years old and she had buried her husband 11 weeks ago, and Raymond's siblings were contesting his will. The attorney's name was Susan Greer and she practiced out of a small office on Clement Street, 2 blocks from the bakery where Ellie still went for coffee on Sunday mornings, and she had the brisk, specific quality of a woman who does not participate in drama she did not create. She reviewed the will, reviewed the amendment, reviewed the medical records that Raymond's doctor provided confirming his mental clarity at the time of the amendment, and told Ellie that the challenge was almost certainly without merit, but that without merit did not mean without cost, that it would take time and money to resolve, and that Ellie should expect the process to be unpleasant. It was unpleasant. The winter passed in phone calls and documents and a deposition that Ellie sat through in a conference room in Richmond while Walter's attorney asked her questions about Raymond's state of mind in language designed to make her feel that her 31 years of proximity to her husband made her a biased rather than a reliable source. She answered every question clearly and without hostility, which she could see frustrated the attorney in the small way that frustrated attorneys are not supposed to show. And she drove home in the February rain thinking that Raymond would have been angry about this in the particular contained way he had of being angry about things that struck him as fundamentally dishonest. She thought about him constantly. This was not a surprise. She had expected to think about him constantly. What had surprised her, in the months since October, was the specific quality of the missing, not the large absences, not the empty side of the bed or the missing coat on the hook by the back door, though those were real, but the small ones. The way she still reached for the remote control and then stopped. The way she cooked too much and then stood at the stove looking at the extra portions as though she had simply forgotten a fact she had been reliably aware of for 11 months. The way she still turned, sometimes, to tell him something, and found the room empty. She had not gone into the attic. This surprised her in a different way. She had thought about it, of course. The key was in the box on Raymond's nightstand with his watch and the rest of the things the hospital had returned to her, and she had put the box in the drawer and not opened the drawer again for 2 months. When she finally had, she had taken out the watch, which she had given to Daniel because he was the eldest and it seemed right. She had taken out the small photograph that Raymond had carried in his wallet for 30 years, the one of his first wife Margaret on a beach somewhere, smiling, looking like someone who did not know the photograph would outlive her by decades. She had kept that photograph because it was not hers to throw away and not his son's to claim, and she had put it in an envelope and sealed it and written Raymond's name on the outside in her best handwriting and put it in the drawer beneath the key. The key stayed in the drawer. She told herself she was not ready. She told herself she was respecting something, though she was no longer entirely certain what. She told herself that whatever Raymond had kept in the attic was his to keep and that unlocking the door now would be a violation of something she had honored for 31 years by not asking. But February became March, and the legal challenge ground on, and she sat with Susan Greer in the office on Clement Street and listened to the latest development. Walter's attorney was requesting an inventory of personal property held in the house, including contents of any locked spaces, and something shifted in her in a way she felt physically, like a key turning. She was not going to let Walter's attorney inventory that room. She was going to open that door herself. She went home on a Thursday evening in mid-March, a gray day with the first suggestions of spring in the forsythia along the fence line and the smell of thaw in the soil along the south-facing beds where she had planted bulbs in the autumn before Raymond died, before she knew the autumn would be the last one with him in the house. She put on the kettle and then did not wait for it to whistle. She went to the drawer in the bedroom and took out the key. It was lighter than she expected. She had never actually held it before. She had seen it held, had watched the particular unconscious intimacy with which Raymond's fingers closed around it when he climbed the stairs, but she had never held it herself. It was brass and smooth on one side and had the ordinary plainness of a thing made for function rather than meaning. There was nothing remarkable about it. It was just a key. She stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment. The house was quiet in the way of late afternoon, the settling sounds of a structure that has been in one place long enough to have its own rhythms. She had lived inside these rhythms for 31 years and they were familiar to her in the way that things that have never been remarkable become remarkable only in their absence. She was not afraid. She did not think she was afraid. She was something else, not afraid, not excited, not dreading, something that did not have a simple name. Something that felt like standing at the end of a 31-year sentence and reading the final period. She climbed the stairs. The door was exactly as it had always been. Pale wood, a little scuffed at the base where it had been kicked open and shut over many years, the brass lock centered at mid-height, slightly tarnished. She stood in front of it and put the key in the lock. The lock was smooth. It had been used regularly, oiled regularly, maintained the way Raymond maintained everything he cared about. It turned without resistance. She felt the bolt slide, felt the door release, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the knob before she pushed it open. The air that came out was cool and still and smelled of old wood and something else, something papery and dry and faintly sweet. That she could not immediately identify. Not musty, not the smell of a space that has been neglected. The smell of a space that has been carefully kept. The smell of a room that someone has tended. She reached inside the doorframe and found the light switch. A lamp came on, not an overhead fixture, a lamp on a table, a real lamp with a real shade, which told her in the first second that this was not a storage attic. This was a room. She stepped inside. The attic ran the full length of the house. The ceiling followed the slope of the roof on both sides, meeting at a ridge beam down the center, and the floor was good plank wood, not the rough sheathing of an unused attic but finished boards, stained and smooth, laid the same way as the floors downstairs. There was a window at the far end, dormered, letting in the gray March light, and under the window was a desk. The desk was old, oak, heavy, the kind of desk built when furniture was intended to outlast the person who bought it. It had a chair pulled up to it, an office chair, worn at the armrests, and on the desk surface there were things arranged with care. A reading lamp. A dictionary. A cup holding pencils. A notebook, closed, with a pencil laid across it at the exact angle of something just set down. On either side of the desk, built into the slopes of the roof, were shelves. Floor to ceiling on both sides, and on the shelves were boxes, archive boxes, labeled in Raymond's careful engineer's handwriting, and between the boxes, filling the spaces, were other things. Books. Folders. And in 3 glass-fronted cases that she could see from the door, objects she could not yet make out clearly. She walked to the center of the room and turned slowly. There was a rocking chair in the corner near the lamp. A small rug on the floor beside it, a braided oval in blues and greens. A side table with a coaster on it, the kind you put a cup on. She looked at these things and understood that Raymond had sat here. That he had come up here, not to store things, but to be here. That this room had been used, had been lived in quietly, in the hours she was downstairs or in the garden or asleep. She had lived with this man for 31 years and she had not known this room was a room. She walked to the nearest glass-fronted case and stood in front of it. Inside were letters. Not loose letters, correspondence, bound with ribbon, labeled in the same careful handwriting. She read the labels on the spines without touching them. Margaret, the top bundle said, in handwriting she recognized as younger, less steady than the Raymond she had known, the handwriting of a man in his 30s. Below it, the dates, 1974 to 1981. Below those, another bundle. Children, it said. And below, Daniel and Paul, 1976 onward. She stood looking at these things for a long time. Then she moved to the desk and pulled out the chair and sat down. The notebook on the desk was the kind Raymond had always used, a composition notebook, black and white cover. She did not open it yet. She put her hands flat on the desk and looked at the room around her, and she understood, in the slow and certain way that she had always understood things about him, that she was sitting in the place where Raymond Marsh had kept the part of himself that he did not know how to carry anywhere else. This was not a secret from her. Or it was, technically, but it was not the kind of secret she had feared without knowing she feared it. It was not another woman. It was not dishonesty or concealment in the dark sense of those words. It was a man who had loved deeply and lost and had never fully found the language to carry his grief in the ordinary spaces of a shared life, and who had built himself a room for it, and who had gone there when he needed to, quietly, without drama, without burdening her with it. She sat for a long time. Outside, the March light was failing, going gold at the edges in the way of late afternoon, and the forsythia along the fence was bright yellow against the gray, and the birds were coming to the feeder she had put up in the autumn, the one Raymond had built a pole for in September when he still could, when the stairs were only beginning to be a negotiation. She had filled it every morning since he died. She kept filling it. She did not entirely know why, except that it seemed important to keep filling it. She opened the notebook. The first page was dated 7 years ago, which would have been Raymond at 70, still working part-time as a consultant, still climbing these stairs, still sitting in this chair in the early mornings before she was awake. His handwriting was precise, the handwriting of an engineer who trusted measurement. He had written, "I have been thinking about what to leave behind, and what to leave out." She read that line twice, and then she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the window and the failing light, and for the first time since October she wept without trying to stop herself. She wept for Raymond and for the 31 years and for the room she had not known existed and for the key she had not known she would one day need to use. She wept for the man who had built a room for his grief at the top of his house and had sat in it alone and had never once asked her to carry it, and she wept because she understood now that this was also a form of love, the most solitary and most selfless kind, the keeping of something away from someone so that it would not diminish them. When she was done weeping she wiped her face with the sleeve of her cardigan and looked around the room again. She had a sense, sitting in that chair in that fading light, that she had not yet understood even a fraction of what this room contained. She would need to come back. She would need to come back many times. She stood and looked at the labeled archive boxes on the shelves, at the glass-fronted cases with their bound letters, at the notebook still open on the desk. She did not touch anything else tonight. She was not ready to touch anything else tonight. She turned off the lamp and walked to the door and stood in the doorway, looking back at the room. The gray light from the dormered window lay across the desk and the rocking chair and the braided rug, and the room had the particular quality of a place that has held something precious for a long time and is only now beginning to release it. She pulled the door shut behind her. She did not lock it. The key went into the pocket of her cardigan, and she went downstairs to make tea, and she sat in the reading chair in the front room with the cup in her hands and the house quiet around her, and she thought about the notebook and the archive boxes and the glass-fronted cases, and she thought about Raymond at 70 sitting in that chair in the early morning, writing. "I have been thinking about what to leave behind, and what to leave out." She thought, he left the key. He left the key on the nightstand with his watch. He had known she would find it eventually. He had known she would open the drawer and find the key and understand, in the patient way she always understood things about him, that it was time. Raymond Marsh had kept a room at the top of his house for 31 years, and he had left her the key. She pressed the key in her pocket and felt its small weight and thought, "I am not done with you yet, Raymond." She was 69 years old and she had buried her husband 11 months ago, and she had just opened a door she had spent 31 years not opening, and she had not yet seen what it held. She would begin tomorrow. She went back the next morning. She had not planned to go first thing. She had told herself, lying in bed in the gray early light, that she would have breakfast first, that she would call Carol and check in the way she did every few days, that she would take her time. But she was up before 6 and the kettle was on before she had fully decided to be awake, and by 6:15 she was climbing the stairs with her coffee cup in one hand and the key already unnecessary in her pocket because the door was unlocked now and would stay that way. She pushed it open and the lamp was where she had left it, the notebook open on the desk, the March light not yet filling the dormered window but beginning to suggest itself at the edges of the sky. She sat in Raymond's chair and pulled the lamp chain and looked at the page she had opened to the night before. I have been thinking about what to leave behind, and what to leave out. Below that first line, Raymond had written more. She had not read further the night before. She had not been ready. She was ready now, or ready enough, which she had come to understand across 69 years was the closest you usually got. He had written, Margaret kept everything. Every letter, every program from every concert we attended, every card from every birthday. She said that the objects were not the memories but that the objects kept the memories honest. She said that memory without evidence tends toward revision, toward making things better or worse than they were, and that the objects held the record straight. I thought she was being sentimental. I understand now that she was being precise. Ellie set her coffee down on the desk and read that paragraph again. She thought about Margaret, whom she had never met, whose photograph she had sealed in an envelope and put in a drawer. She thought about the quality of a woman who distinguished between sentiment and precision, who understood that the difference between the two was not affection but accuracy. She thought about Raymond at 30, 35, 40, living with a woman like that, learning from a woman like that, and then losing her. She turned the page. The notebook was not a diary, exactly. It was more like the kind of document an engineer makes when he is trying to organize something complicated, not a record of daily events but a working through of things, a systematic approach to material that resisted systematizing. There were dates at the top of each entry but they were not consecutive. Sometimes weeks passed between entries. Sometimes there were 2 in a single week. The content moved around in time, sometimes describing something from the present, a walk he had taken, a thing she had said at dinner that he wanted to remember, and sometimes reaching back decades, sometimes to his childhood, sometimes to his first marriage, sometimes to the years between Margaret's death and Ellie's arrival. She read for 2 hours without stopping. She learned things she had not known. Not secret things, not things that changed the shape of what she had understood their marriage to be, but things that filled in the space around the shape, the way a photograph gains meaning when you know the context of the day it was taken. She learned that Raymond had cried when Daniel was born, genuinely wept, standing in the hospital corridor while a nurse brought him a cup of bad coffee, because he had been so certain, in those months of Margaret's first pregnancy, that the world was going to refuse to give him this. She learned that he had kept a garden in the years he lived alone, after Margaret died, a kitchen garden along the south-facing fence, and that when Ellie had planted one in the same spot in the first spring of their marriage he had stood at the kitchen window watching her work and felt something he described, in his careful engineer's language, as a structural repair. Like something that had been compromised and was now reinforced. She put the notebook down and looked at the window. A structural repair. 31 years together and he had written those 2 words about watching her plant tomatoes, and she had not known, had never known, because Raymond had not been a man who said these things aloud. He had been a man who wrote them, up here, alone, in the early mornings before she was awake. She picked up the notebook again and read. Until the light in the dormered window had gone fully gold with morning, and then she set it down and looked around the room with different eyes than she had brought to it the night before. The archive boxes on the shelves were labeled with the same precision as everything else in the room. She stood and walked to the nearest shelf and read the labels without touching anything. Each box had a date range and a subject heading in Raymond's handwriting. There were boxes labeled with his work project names she recognized from things he had mentioned over the years, county contracts, consulting jobs, the long infrastructure project in the river corridor that had taken most of his final working decade. There were boxes labeled family, subdivided by year. There were boxes she could not immediately categorize, labeled with single words she would need to investigate: survey, acquisition, land, river. The glass-fronted cases held more than the bound letters she had noticed the night before. She stood in front of the second case and looked through the glass. There were documents here too, but of a different kind, not personal correspondence but official papers, folded and unfolded many times along their creases, the kind of documents that move through many hands. She could see the word deed on the top edge of one. She could see what appeared to be survey maps, hand-drawn in the precise style of county surveys from several decades back, rolled and standing in a holder at the case's side. She did not open the case yet. She was learning, in these first days of the room, to go slowly, to let herself absorb what she had before reaching for the next thing. This was not like her. She was a practical woman who had always believed in addressing things directly. But this room required a different pace, one that matched the pace at which Raymond had built it, which had been over decades and without hurry. She went back to the notebook. There were 43 entries across 7 years. She counted them on her third morning in the room, sitting with a cup of tea while the spring light came through the dormer. Not because she needed to count them but because she was beginning to understand that the notebook was organized, that it had a direction, that Raymond had been writing towards something. She found the entry that confirmed this on the 4th morning. It was dated 2 years ago. He had been 75 then, and the handwriting was still steady but had the particular economy of a man who understands his time is finite and does not want to waste it on words that don't carry weight. He had written, "I have been thinking about what happens to the land when I'm gone." Not the legal question. Susan has been very clear about the legal question and the will is settled. The other question. The question of whether Ellie will know what she has. She stopped reading. She read that line again. Whether Ellie will know what she has. Her hands were very still on the notebook. Outside the window the April birds were at the feeder and the forsythia had gone over and the first leaves were on the ornamental pear at the corner of the yard, and she sat in Raymond's chair in Raymond's room and understood that the notebook was, at least in part, addressed to her. She had not understood this before. She had known, in a general way, that he had left the key, that he had intended for her to find the room, that the key on the nightstand was not an accident. But she had thought of the room as something she was discovering about Raymond, learning about the interior life of a man she had loved for 31 years without having access to this particular part of him. She had not understood that Raymond had also intended for her to learn something about herself. About what she had. About what she was going to need to know. She read the rest of the entry. She doesn't go looking for things. This is one of the things I love about her. She has never been someone who looks for problems or searches out what isn't offered. She trusts. She has always trusted, which has sometimes been taken for granted by people who mistook patience for passivity. It is not passivity. Ellie is the least passive person I know. She is simply someone who gives things the space they need. But there are things in this room that she will need to find, and she will need to know what they mean, and I won't be there to explain. So I'm going to explain here. She turned the page with careful hands. What followed was not an entry in the usual sense. It was more like a guide, the kind of document an engineer writes when he wants to make sure that whoever comes after him can understand what he built. He had written it in sections. Each section referred to something in the room. Each section explained what it was and why it mattered. She read the first section heading, "The Land." Below it, Raymond had written, in the third glass case on the right-hand shelf, there is a folder marked River Survey 1987 to 2019. Inside the folder are the survey maps and the acquisition documents for the 40 acres along the Braden River. I want to explain these because the will divides the land, and I believe there is a possibility that what the will divides is not entirely what the will's beneficiaries understand it to be. She got up from the desk and went to the third glass case on the right-hand shelf. It was not locked. None of the cases were locked, only the room itself had been locked, and she understood now that this had been enough, that the room had been the safeguard, not the individual pieces inside it. She opened the case and found the folder marked River Survey 1987 to 2019 and carried it to the desk and opened it. The survey maps were detailed and precise, as she would have expected from a man who had spent his career in civil engineering. They showed the land along the Braden River south of Clover Hill, the 40 acres named in the will, but they showed more than 40 acres. The surveys were cumulative, dated at intervals across 30 years, and each one showed slightly more than the one before it. Not because the land had changed. Because Raymond had been acquiring parcels adjacent to the original 40, piece by piece, across 3 decades, and the surveys had been updated each time a new parcel was added. She counted the parcels on the most recent survey, dated 2019, for years before Raymond died. There were 7 distinct parcels shown, bounded and labeled with their legal descriptions. The 40 acres named in the will was one of them. She found the acquisition documents behind the surveys. Each parcel had its own folder inside the larger one, each folder containing the deed of purchase, the survey documents, the title insurance, and in some cases correspondence with the sellers. She went through them methodically, the way Raymond had taught her, without meaning to teach her, simply by being a methodical man she had lived beside for 31 years. The 7 parcels. She added up the acreage from the individual surveys. 211 acres. She sat back in the chair. Raymond had not owned 40 acres along the Braden River. Raymond had owned 211 acres along the Braden River, accumulated quietly over 30 years, in parcels small enough that no single acquisition would attract attention, in a river corridor that she now needed to understand the significance of. She went back to the notebook. He had written, "The river corridor has been the subject of conservation interest for 20 years. The County Land Trust has been acquiring land along the Braden in sections, trying to assemble a continuous protected corridor from the reservoir to the county line. The gaps in the corridor are what make it incomplete. The largest remaining gap, the section that would allow the corridor to connect fully, runs through our land. Not through the 40 acres. Through the full 211. She read that paragraph 3 times. I have been in correspondence with the Braden River Land Trust for 4 years. The correspondence is in the box on the second shelf labeled Land Trust. They know about the full acreage. They have been waiting for the estate to settle before making a formal approach. They will approach Ellie. She should be prepared for what they will offer." He had been in correspondence with the Land Trust for 4 years. He had known, for 4 years, what the land was worth to the right buyer. He had accumulated it carefully over 3 decades, saying nothing, entering it into no conversation she could remember, paying the property taxes which she now realized she had never thought to examine out of accounts she had access to but had never closely examined because Raymond managed the accounts and she had trusted him to manage the accounts. She was not angry. She examined herself for anger and found none. What she found instead was something stranger and more complicated, a kind of awe, the feeling of standing at the edge of something large and looking across it and understanding that the scale of it is beyond what you initially perceived. Raymond had been building something for 30 years. He had been building it quietly, without announcement, the way he built everything, not for show, not for drama, but because he had decided it needed to be built and had gotten on with building it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She sat in his chair in his room and looked at the survey map spread across his desk, and she thought about Walter's attorney requesting an inventory of personal property held in locked spaces. She thought about Frances on the phone in December with her careful voice explaining that there were questions. She thought about Gordon calling Raymond every Sunday evening for conversations she had never been invited into. She thought about 31 years of Sunday evenings. She picked up the notebook and turned to the next section. Raymond had labeled it simply, "What Walter Doesn't Know." She almost laughed. It was so unlike him, that directness, that rare flash of something that in anyone else would have been called dry humor, but in Raymond was simply the most efficient way to label the content. What Walter doesn't know. She could hear his voice saying it, not with malice, not with satisfaction, just with the factual tone of a man labeling a folder. She read it. Walter has believed since our father's death that the riverland was marginal. This was the assessment of the estate attorney in 1989 when our father's farm was divided. and Walter accepted it and has held it for 35 years. He believes the 40 acres represents the least valuable portion of what our father left. He has said so to me on multiple occasions. He has also said, on multiple occasions, that he considers my decision to acquire additional acreage along the river corridor to be a failure of financial judgment. She remembered now, dimly, something Raymond had mentioned once. A conversation with Walter at Christmas, a difference of opinion about land values, something Raymond had been dismissive of in the way he was dismissive of things he found too obvious to argue. She had not paid attention because she had been in the kitchen and the conversation had been between the brothers and it had seemed like the kind of thing she was not meant to be part of. She paid attention now. Walter's position in the will challenge is based on his belief that the estate's primary value resides in the house and the financial accounts, and that the land is, at best, a modest asset not worth the cost of the legal challenge if the other assets were secure. He doesn't know about the full acreage. He doesn't know about the land trust correspondence. He doesn't know what the river corridor is worth to a conservation buyer. He has been conducting a legal challenge to gain assets he has undervalued, overlooking the most significant thing in the estate because he stopped looking after he decided he already knew what there was to find. The notebook entry ended there. Below it, in Raymond's handwriting, were 2 lines separated from the rest by a space. She will know. I made sure she would know. This is what the room is for. Ellie sat for a long time after reading those lines. The birds were still at the feeder and the morning had gone full and bright, a proper April morning with the particular sweetness of a season just becoming itself, and she sat in the chair Raymond had sat in and held the notebook he had written for her and felt something move through her that was not grief, exactly, though it was related to grief. It was the feeling of being known. Of being seen. Not in the easy, immediate way of someone telling you that you matter, but in the slow, patient, 31-year way of someone who has been paying attention across an entire marriage and has left a record of that attention for you to find. He had known she would not be destroyed by this. He had known she would climb the stairs and open the door and sit in his chair and read his careful words and understand what they were telling her. He had known she was, as he had written, the least passive person he knew. He had built the room to hold what he could not carry in conversation, and he had left the key where she would find it, and he had trusted her to do the rest. She closed the notebook and put her hands flat on the desk. There were more sections. She had seen the headings as she turned the pages: Margaret, children, survey, trust, the letters, and she would read them all. She would spend weeks in this room reading and understanding. But today she needed to do something practical, something outside the room, because that was also what Raymond had trusted her to do. She needed to call Susan Greer. She went downstairs and made fresh coffee and sat at the kitchen table and called the attorney's office and asked for an appointment as soon as possible. The assistant said Tuesday. She said that would be fine. Then she called Carol. Carol was the one person she had told about finding the room. Not the contents, not yet, just the existence of it, and the notebook, and the general outline of what Raymond had left for her. Carol had listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode but which she achieved when she understood that the moment required it, and when Ellie finished she had been quiet for a moment and then said, "So he knew." He knew what? Ellie had asked. That you'd need something to hold on to. That the room would be it. She thought about that now, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the spring light coming through the kitchen window where she had planted herbs along the sill every year for 31 years, the same herbs in the same terracotta pots, basil and thyme and flat-leaf parsley. She had planted this spring's basil 2 weeks ago, before she found the room. She had planted it without thinking because it was time to plant it, and she had always planted it, and some things you continue because stopping them would cost you more than the continuing. The Tuesday appointment with Susan Greer was the beginning of a different part of the story. She brought the survey maps. She brought the acquisition documents for all 7 parcels. She brought the land trust correspondence, which she had found in the box on the second shelf exactly where Raymond had described it, a folder thick with letters spanning 4 years, the most recent dated 8 months before he died. She spread them on Susan's conference table and watched the attorney read with the concentrated focus of a person who reads documents for a living and has learned to let her face reveal only what she chooses. When Susan finished reading, she looked up. She said, "Raymond knew about the will challenge." Ellie nodded. He had written about it, not by name, because he had written the relevant notebook entries 2 years before it became a legal matter, but he had anticipated it. He had anticipated that Walter would challenge, and he had anticipated the ground on which Walter would challenge, and he had addressed it. Susan said, "The 211 acres are not in the will as 211 acres. No. The will named the 40-acre parcel, the one Raymond had inherited from his father. The additional parcels were in Raymond's name, individually deeded, their acquisition documents in this room, but the will had not combined them into a single described property. This was not an oversight, Ellie was now certain. Raymond had organized everything else with too much precision for this to be an oversight. She had thought about this for 2 days before the appointment and she thought she understood it. If the will had described 211 acres, Walter's attorney would have flagged the value immediately. The challenge would have been filed with different targets. Raymond had named the 40 acres the land Walter already knew about, the land Walter had already dismissed as marginal and had left the rest in the archive boxes to be found by the person he had trusted to find them. Susan said, "The additional parcels transfer to you by operation of the acquisitions themselves, not through the will. The deeds are in your name as surviving spouse for most of the later purchases." She shuffled through the documents. "All parcels from 2004 onward list you as co-owner. The earlier ones, the 3 parcels from the late 1980s and 1990s, those are in Raymond's name alone, and they go through the estate. Which the estate is currently being contested." "Which the estate is currently being contested," Susan confirmed. "But the contested portions of the will relate to the distribution of assets between you and Raymond's children. The challenge brought by the siblings has a different basis and," she paused, "a weaker one. Now that we have the full picture of the land holding, I want to revisit the challenge entirely." Ellie looked at the survey map on the table. 211 acres along the Braden River, bounded to the north by the county road and to the south by the river itself, the corridor that the land trust had been trying to assemble for 20 years. She said, "There's correspondence from the land trust in that folder. Raymond had been talking to them." Susan found the folder and read it. When she finished, she set it down with the particular careful deliberateness of someone who wants to make sure they are responding to what is actually in front of them and not to their reaction to it. She said, "I need to make some calls. I need to talk to the land trust directly and I need to get an appraisal on the full holding. The conservation value of a corridor parcel this size, in this location." She stopped. She looked at Ellie. Raymond was very careful about this. He was, Ellie agreed. He was protecting it. The land and you both. He was making sure that anyone who came after him, anyone who thought they already knew what there was to find, would be working with incomplete information. She thought about the notebook entry. He stopped looking after he decided he already knew what there was to find. Raymond writing about Walter. Raymond knowing, with the quiet certainty of a man who had watched his brother dismiss things for 60 years, that Walter would stop looking the moment he believed he had the picture. Walter had stopped looking at the 40 acres. He had not looked at the room above the stairs. Susan called 3 days later with the name of the appraiser she wanted to use, a firm out of Charlottesville that specialized in conservation easement valuations and had done work with the Braden River Land Trust before. She also said that she had spoken with the Land Trust's executive director, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, no relation, she said, though Ellie noted the name with a small private recognition, who had confirmed the correspondence with Raymond and who had expressed both condolences and, in Susan's precise paraphrase, considerable interest in continuing the conversation with his estate. Ellie said that was fine. She said she would like to meet with the Land Trust directly, not just through the attorney, and Susan said she would arrange it. She went back to the room every morning. She had developed a routine around it, the way she developed routines around everything that mattered, not rigidly, but with the consistency of someone who understands that important things deserve regular attention. She brought coffee. She sat in Raymond's chair. She read. She was working through the notebook systematically now, following the section guide Raymond had left. The section labeled Margaret she read slowly, over several mornings, and it taught her things about grief that she had not known she was still learning. Raymond had written about Margaret with a precision that was its own form of tenderness, not romanticizing her, not constructing a monument, but documenting her accurately, the way someone documents a structure they respect, noting both its strengths and the places where it showed its age. He had loved Margaret and he had grieved her, and he wrote about this with a carefulness that she recognized as honesty. Eventually come to understand that loving Ellie did not diminish what he had felt for Margaret, and that perhaps the capacity to love twice, fully, without the second erasing the first, was itself a kind of grace. She sat with that for a long time. She read the section labeled Children on a Friday morning with the window open because the April had turned genuinely warm and the garden needed the air and she needed the sound of the birds. Raymond had written about Daniel and Paul with the specific sorrow of a father who had understood, too late and too gradually to correct, that he had taught his sons to manage their feelings rather than to feel them. He had written, I was so certain, when they were small, that composure was strength. I did not understand until they were grown that I had confused the container with the contents. He had written about watching Ellie with them at Christmas, watching her try, year after year, to build something warmer than the careful politeness they brought to the table, and he had written that he was sorry he had not helped her more. That he had not understood until he was older what it had cost her to keep trying. She closed the notebook on that entry and sat for a while. She had not expected to find an apology in the notebook. She had not known she needed one. She sat with it now and found that it did not make her sad, exactly it made her feel seen in the particular way of understanding that someone who is gone had been paying attention in a way you had not known. The appraiser came on a Thursday in late April, a man named Garrett with the outdoor-worn quality of someone who spends considerable time walking land and the quiet competence of someone who has been doing it for 20 years. He walked the river parcels with Ellie over 2 days, using the survey maps from the archive box and his own equipment, and he asked specific questions about Raymond's acquisition timeline and about the land trust's interest and about the condition of the river corridor through the property. On the second afternoon, standing at the southern boundary of the land where the Braden River moved through a stand of old sycamores, he said, "Your husband understood what he had here." "He did," she said. The river corridor value. Garrett chose his words with the care of a professional who does not want to set expectations he cannot support. The river corridor value is significant. In a conservation easement context, with the land trust's interest confirmed and the corridor position established, the valuation range is going to be considerably higher than a standard agricultural or residential assessment. How considerably, she asked. He said he would have the formal appraisal in 2 weeks. He said she should prepare herself for a number that would require some adjustment. She walked back to the house along the fence line, through the kitchen garden, past the herb pots on the sill. She had replanted the thyme that morning because the winter had taken it, and the new plant was small and bright green in the terracotta pot, the particular green of something just beginning. She thought about Raymond walking the same fence line, 30 years, 40 years, across the whole span of their marriage, knowing what he was building and saying nothing, trusting the room and the notebook and the key on the nightstand to say it for him. She put her hand on the kitchen door and looked back at the garden. She thought, I am not done learning what you left me, Raymond. She thought, I don't think I'm close to done. The appraisal arrived on a Tuesday morning, which she had come to think of, after months of Susan Greer's Tuesday calls, as the day the important things happened. It came as a formal document, bound and tabbed, with Garrett's firm's letterhead and the precise language of a professional valuation. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee and the herb pots on the sill and the spring light coming through the window at the angle that meant it was still early, still the quiet part of the morning before the day made its demands. The number was on page 4. She read it once and set the document down and looked out the window at the garden. Then she picked it up and read it again. The 211 acres along the Braden River, valued as a conservation corridor parcel in the context of the Land Trust's established acquisition program, carried an appraised value that was not a modest asset. It was not marginal. It was not the kind of number that Walter had spent 35 years believing the Riverland represented. It was the kind of number that reordered things. That changed what the word estate meant when applied to Raymond Marsh of Clover Hill, Virginia, who had spent his career as a county engineer and his weekends working quietly on projects he did not discuss and his mornings in a locked room at the top of his house writing things down for the woman he trusted to find them. She called Susan before 8 o'clock. Susan had already read her copy. There was a pause after Ellie said good morning, the particular pause of an attorney who is choosing her words with precision, and then Susan said, Raymond was a very deliberate man. He was, Ellie said. The Land Trust had confirmed their interest in a conservation easement negotiation covering the full corridor parcel. Helen Marsh, still no relation, had called the previous afternoon. The easement structure would allow Ellie to retain ownership of the land while permanently protecting it from development, and the compensation for the easement rights on a parcel of this size and position in the corridor was substantial. Susan named a figure. It was not the appraised value of the land outright, but it was significant in a way that the word significant does not fully carry. It was the kind of figure that cleared things. That opened things. That turned the question of what came next from an anxious calculation into a genuine choice. Ellie sat at the table for a long time after she put the phone down. She thought about Walter's attorney's letter requesting an inventory of locked spaces. She thought about Frances on the phone in December with her careful explanations about questions that needed to be asked. She thought about the legal challenge that had been grinding through the winter and into the spring, costing money and time and the particular energy that conflict extracts from a person whether they want it to or not. She thought about Walter, who had stopped looking after he decided he already knew what there was to find. She thought about the 40 acres. Walter had built his entire challenge around the belief that the primary value in Raymond's estate was the house and the financial accounts, and that the land was a modest asset worth contesting only incidentally. He had been conducting a legal challenge to gain access to things he had valued correctly, while overlooking the thing he had never thought to value at all. This was not Ellie's doing. She had not maneuvered him into this position. Raymond had not maneuvered him, not with any malice, not with any intention of harm. Raymond had simply built something, quietly, over 30 years, and had left it to the person he trusted, and Walter had looked at the surface of the estate and decided he could see the whole of it. He had been wrong about that for 3 decades without knowing it. Susan filed the response to the will challenge on a Wednesday in May. It included the full survey documentation, the acquisition records for all 7 parcels, and the appraisal. It also included the land trust correspondence, Raymond's 4 years of careful negotiation with Helen Marsh's organization, the letters that had sat in the archive box on the second shelf of the attic room while Walter's attorney argued about mental capacity and asset distribution. She did not hear from Walter directly. The call came through his attorney, relayed to Susan, and Susan relayed it to Ellie on the following Tuesday morning with the neutral tone of a professional delivering information she is privately satisfied about. Walter's attorney was recommending withdrawal of the challenge. The basis for the challenge had, in the attorney's framing, become less clear upon review of newly presented documentation. Susan said, "In my experience, that phrase means they didn't know what they were looking at until it was too late to look at it differently." Ellie said, "Raymond would have found that sentence very precise." The challenge was formally withdrawn in the second week of May. There were no calls from Walter. There was a brief written communication from Frances, 3 sentences, that acknowledged the resolution of the legal matter and expressed something written as condolences but read more as the deflation of someone who had been certain of an outcome and had found the certainty misplaced. Gordon did not communicate at all. She did not feel victorious. She examined herself for triumph, for the satisfaction of a contest won, and found very little of either. What she found instead was the specific quiet of a thing that has been resolved, not won, resolved, and the space that resolution opened up where the conflict had been. She had not sought this. She had opened a door and read a notebook and followed the instructions of a man she had loved for 31 years. And the outcome had been what it had been because Raymond had been careful and because he had known her well enough to trust her with it. She went up to the room the morning after the withdrawal was confirmed and sat in the chair and opened the notebook to the last entry. It was dated 11 months before Raymond died, written in handwriting that was smaller now, more deliberate, the handwriting of a man managing the effort of each letter. He had written only a paragraph. If you are reading this at the end, Ellie, then you found the room and you read what I left and you did what you always do, which is exactly what needed doing, without drama and without fuss. I have watched you do this for 31 years. I never told you enough how much I relied on it. I am telling you now because now I have the space to say it plainly. You were the structural repair. And you held. You always held. She sat with that for a long time. Then she wiped her face and went to the window and looked out at the garden, the fence line, and beyond it, though she could not see it from here, the river land 211 acres of Braden River corridor that Raymond had spent 30 years assembling and left to her with a key and a notebook and the patient certainty that she would know what to do. The conservation easement was signed in July, on a morning that was warm and clear, in the conference room of the Land Trust with Helen Marsh across the table and Susan beside her. The ceremony was modest, which she appreciated. No fanfare, no speeches, just the documents and the signatures and then Helen Marsh's handshake, firm and genuine, and her saying, "Raymond told us you would know what to do with it." "He told you that?" Ellie said. "In his last letter to us. 8 months before he died. He said the land was in good hands and that we should be patient." Helen smiled. "We were patient." She drove home along the river road, the sycamores visible through the passenger window, the Braden moving below them in the unhurried way of a river that has been in the same place for a very long time. She drove slowly. She was not in a hurry either. She had made her decisions about the easement proceeds in the weeks of waiting for the paperwork. A portion went to establish a scholarship fund at the community college in Clover Hill, where Raymond had served on an advisory board and had believed, quietly and without announcement, that the infrastructure of a community was not only its roads and bridges. A portion went directly to the Land Trust, designated for the final acquisitions needed to complete the corridor. And a portion she kept not extravagantly, not beyond what a woman of 69 living alone in a house she loved could call security. Enough that the question of what came next was answered. Enough that she would not have to ask anyone for anything. She told Daniel and Paul about the attic room before the easement was signed. She had driven to see Daniel in Richmond and brought copies of the relevant notebook entries and sat with him at his kitchen table and let him read. He had been quiet for a long time when he finished. Then he said, "He never told us any of this." And she said, gently, that she knew, and that she thought Raymond had not known how, and that she hoped the record he left was some form of the conversation he had not managed to have in person. Daniel did not say anything else for a while. But before she left he hugged her, not the careful, managed embrace of 31 careful Christmases, but something more unguarded than that. Something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of trying. She went back to the room every morning. This did not change. She had finished the notebook and the archive boxes and the bound letters, and still she went, because the room had become something beyond its contents. It was the place where she felt closest to Raymond, not because she believed in closeness of that kind in any mystical sense, but because the room held the record of his attention, and sitting in it was sitting inside the evidence that she had been known, fully and carefully, by someone who had taken the trouble to write it down. She had moved the rocking chair to the window. Added a small bookshelf. Brought up the time pot, the new one, which was now lush and full on the windowsill. The room was still Raymond's. It was also becoming hers. On a September morning, almost a year to the day from when Raymond died, she sat in the rocking chair with the window open and the early light falling across the desk and the river land just visible through the trees at the property's edge. She thought about what it meant to have spent 31 years beside someone without knowing a room like this existed, and to find, on the other side of losing them, that the room was the thing that most fully explained everything. He had loved her carefully. He had loved her with the attention of someone who notices and records and does not always say aloud but never forgets. He had built a room for the parts of himself he could not carry into the ordinary spaces of a shared life, and he had trusted her to find it, and He had left her not just the room and the notebook and the land, but the specific knowledge that she had been seen clearly by someone who had looked with the kind of attention that most people never receive and many never give. She was 69 years old and she was a widow and she lived alone in a house on Sycamore Road with a kitchen garden and a feeder full of birds and an attic room with the window open to the September morning, and she understood now, exactly where she was supposed to be. The door at the top of the stairs had been locked for 31 years. It had taken her 11 months to open it. What she found inside was not a secret. It was not a revelation that undid anything or recast anyone as other than they had been. It was something quieter and more enduring than a secret. It was a record. A record of a man who had paid attention, and a marriage that had held, and land tended quietly across 30 years by someone who understood that the most valuable things are often the ones no one else has thought to look for. The door was open now. It would stay open. She rocked gently in the chair and looked out at the morning and thought, I know who you were, Raymond. She thought, thank you for making sure I would. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.